time. And really uncanny to meet Emma because she looks so much like her. I suppose it's because I but I saw it as well, and I was like, oh, she looks like my mother. No, it's like
Bruxelles by night, and we are in the Nicc.
Well, that's it.
Inside.
Let's do the picture of it. Alright.
So yeah. Everything is working right now. I'm very happy to see a lot of your beautiful faces. Thanks a lot for coming, and thanks a lot for coming early. It's going to be kind of a long afternoon evening in which several people are going to be speaking to us. We're going to watch a film, and there's a show to see. The project is called Pollination Pansies, and it includes works by a talk by ANDWIG, a Q&A we're going to have with LIONEL SOUKAZ. We're going to present a movie by LIONEL SOUKAZ and HOCQUENGHEM called RASDEP. There's a window exhibition by HUSEYIN OYLUM, and SUSANA VARGAS is going to be the first one speaking to us. So I would just directly, I propose to just directly open with Susana. She's going to give a talk titled Queer Pigmentocracy. Susana Vargas holds a PhD in philosophy from McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She currently is Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Aesthetic Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and her research focuses on the different cultural understandings in gender, sex, class, and skin tonalities between Latin America and Anglo-North America, and their intersection with visual culture. She's the author of the book Mujercitos, that you actually have here, and most recently co-curated the exhibition in Giro di Notte e Consumium Igni from the Jumex collection. It's too loud? Yeah.
Not on the mixing table.
Not here.
Otherwise the
Here.
lights go down.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Susana, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that invitation. And I wish I could see everyone.
Wait, we're going to solve this in a moment.
Yeah.
This is everyone.
Hello. Thank you. Okay, so in the recent year, I have been actually trying to work on the potential of queer as a methodology that can challenge patterns of Anglo-North American colonization and the legacy of a pigmentocratic culture, although it is an import from the Anglo-Saxon world. I would like to first talk about the notion of queer, and then what I mean by pigmentocracy, and finally how it can be associated to visuality. I am sure that most of you are familiar with the history of the term queer, having it been first used as an insult to interpolate a subject through shame. It was reappropriated against that shame, but for empowerment during the 90s by activist groups in the United States. Then the term was taken by academics, such as Teresa de Laureti and her colleagues at the University of California, Santa Cruz, to organize a conference called Queer Theory in 1990. The work of Gail Rubin, of Bersani, of Sedgwick, of Judith Butler had already developed an analysis of sexuality and its connections to structures of power, moving away from orientation to individual choices and psychology. Their work showed that sex and pleasure can challenge the normative frameworks by which we by which some kinds of sex are legitimized and others delegitimize and institutionalize as a proper form of sexuality. So queer started as a promise to fill the silences that the gay and lesbian studies at the moment had forgotten, to include lesbians in the gay studies, or to talk about race and class along gender and sexuality. However, very soon, this promise was proven to fail, and even in 1994, the Labellis pointed out that the term had, quote, very quickly become a conceptually vacuous creature of the publishing industry. 25 years later, we are talking about a growing homogenizing queer identity immersed in global capitalism and consumerism. In Latin America, the term queer has growingly entered the academy, but it's a total different story than how it came about in the United States and Canada. I will be interested to know how it has entered Brussels and the French language. It is similar than in Spanish in the way that the power of queer as a performative act, a speech act, lies in its heterability and situationality. In Spanish, if I say I am queer, I am citing an Anglicism, not a term of denigration that now is used for empowerment. On the contrary, through saying I am queer, and some activists write it as it sounds phonetically, C-U-I-R, and still showing a certain power of mobility or cultural capital. I'm performing the speech act, I am queer, but I am showing a privilege, one that is reserved mostly for academics. So queer works as an identity, sometimes as a synonym for LGBT populations, but in the words of ANDWIG, simultaneously tries to affirm and eradicate identity. It also works as a practice to talk about the sexual object of choice, to talk about dissenting sexual practices and gender expressions. And finally, as politics, a social mobilization independent of the subject's identity or sexual gender practices. In these ways, queer has a lot of potential despite being an Anglicism for Latin America, as a theory and methodology that involves many different disciplines into account. But mostly what is interesting to me is the potential to create a network of transnational solidarity. On the other hand, I talk about pigmentocracy, or a pigmentocratic social system, to designate the entangled relationship in Mexico and between Mexicans to skin tonalities and social stratification. A relationship that has been defined since the Spanish colonization and in the subsequent colonial period, and has continued to the present day. Within this relationship, the skin color has been a marker of class. Lighter skin tonalities are associated with the upper and middle European ruling classes, occupying the affluent and privileged positions, while darker tones are associated with indigenousness, with lower socioeconomic positions, and with exposure to racism and labor discrimination. Whiteness being the space of privilege and the desired subject position. Here, skin tonalities work not so much as simple markers of race or class, but also as power mechanism, interdependent, reproducible, and their analysis could be considered as a pigmentocratic system. In this system, I'm interested in how a queer methodology can allow me to analyze how skin tonalities are a biological prime and a social construct based in perception. My aim with this research is to problematize how processes of subjectivation and subject identification are informed as much by class and skin tonalities as by gender-sex identifications. As such, my project maps some of the zones of tension between the main Anglo-North American theories of performative gender sex within the pigmentocratic sociocultural system of Mexico. I want to briefly give an example based on the doctoral dissertation in which I analyze the photographs of mujercitos, or effeminate men, as named by the magazine Alarma from 1963 to 1986. And I think that now Alberto is going to show you an image. It's the same one that I think you were seeing at the beginning.
Yeah.
So Lorena sits on a chair, her left arm lying softly over her purse on her lap, while her right elbow rests on a desk. Her hand delicately holds her head. There is nothing shy about her. Her strong features further reaffirm their attitude. There is no option but to be captivated by Lorena's seductive gaze. Her penetrating look is directed at you. She's beautiful, and this photograph shows it. This black and white photograph appeared on the back cover of the issue 217 of Alarma on June 17, 1970. Alarma is a definitive example of Nota Roja, a popular periodical gender characterized by its gruesome photographs of dead bodies. Yet Lorena is not pictured dead, burned, or mutilated. On the contrary, for 23 consecutive years, with a print run of 500,000 copies, Alarma featured every month a photograph of a mujercito like Lorena. I read in the posing of Lorena a performative act of subversion, occupying a space of female subjectivity that the text and the larger society at large denies her. Moreover, I read her gender performance as reflecting a desire to access class privilege, which in Mexico is inseparable from skin tonalities, rather than their identification with hegemonic identities. These and many other photographs of mujercitos enact what Cuauhtémoc Medina notes in his analysis of the photographs of 19th century prostitutes in Oaxaca, Mexico. I quote, "It is the realization of a desire, not to see yourself how you really are, but how you would have wanted to have been." End of quote. Medina discusses these photographs as a theater of identity struggle in which the photograph's official function was to control sex workers through identification, while sex workers, through posing and control over the camera, provided themselves with a different identity, an idealized version of themselves. Mujercitos posing for the camera of Alarma provide for themselves an identity not of what they are, but of what they might have wanted to become. For example, Lorena is a model for a high-end fashion magazine. I don't argue that Lorena wants to become a woman, but to occupy the space of femininity that the text and the larger society denies her. But at the same time, to occupy the space of whiteness, the subject's privileged position. If I argue that mujercitos might not want to become real women, as it is discussed by Judith Butler on her analysis of Venus Extravaganza in Paris is Burning, this is because their labor, as sex workers, doesn't necessarily benefit from such becoming. In her work on travestis and transgender sex workers in Mexico, Debra Castillo found that it is more profitable to fulfill a common fantasy among Mexican men, that is, quote, to have sex with a woman that has a penis, end of quote. Similarly, work on travesti sex workers found that many Mexican men hold a fantasy known as the macho probado, that is, to take on the passive role during sex and be penetrated. Many Latin American researchers know that although many men have sex with men, they do not self-identify as homosexual, gay, or bisexual. For example, the work of Carrier, Nerstein, Núñez Noriega, or Krier. Their gender sexual identity is not identical to their sexual practice. Indeed, identity and practice in Mexico do not necessarily express continuity and coherence relations between gender, sex, sexual orientation, practice, and desire, but instead are deeply entangled with social stratification. Given the centrality of questions of economic survival and social stratification, labor is a major site of contention. For people with peripheral sexualities, within middle-class spaces, gender presentation follows a normal relation of coherence between gender and sex, regardless of sexual orientation. Men can look more masculine and women more feminine. However, vestidas and travestis from lower classes normally work in beauty salon or as sex workers. Self-identified gay subjects are often more middle-upper class and much less effeminate. But on the other hand, in lower and working-class sectors, gender presentation has an inconsistent relation to sex or sexual orientation. Many more women can be masculine, and many more men are feminine, independent of a sexual orientation or practice, without rendering them unintelligible as subjects. In the post-colonial democratic social-cultural system of Mexico, questions of subjective intelligibility must take into account the ways in which class, skin tonality is deeply entangled with labor. In Alarma, Mujercitos negotiated this system by enacting their aspirations through photographs, showing themselves as they wish to have been, performing sexualized femininity, and inhabiting spaces of socioeconomic privilege, while maintaining their erotic capital as sex workers. These photographs show how in Mexico class-skin tonality relations play a determining role in the constitution of subjectivity in the same way that gender sex does elsewhere. And I think I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I would like to now open it to questions. If anyone wants to ask her about any part of her presentation or make any comment, I think you'll also be happy to hear that, I imagine. I had this, so you started saying that you would be interested in knowing what was happening in the Brussels socio-political context.
Yes.
Related to language. Perhaps you could try to formulate that question more precisely, or in an easier way to answer, and perhaps someone here will be able to answer to that question of yours.
Sure. What I meant was that queer in Spanish is an English sound. Maybe it's different because also a lot of people in Brussels speak English, so there's not that separation linguistical that is also pointing to a class separation and a privilege separation. Because I'll say that in Mexico, less people speak English as an everyday language. It is not hard. It's like, it's a language, it's a foreign language, it's something you learn. It's not bicultural country. Mm-hmm. So if you are talking about, if you say queer, you are using a foreign term that has been learned. Mm-hmm. So if you rid it of all the potential of citationality that it had from the States. So that cultural translation must bring citationality and translation into account. As I was saying, if I say in Mexico, in Spanish, soy queer, it's not the same as if I were to say it in North America. And in Mexico, I'm talking about a privilege.
Of knowing the word already, like the privilege of, as you said, being attached to academy in a certain way and using a foreign term.
Exactly.
Yeah. I believe it's pretty similar in Belgium, because in Belgium is also, I believe English is a learned language in Belgium. I understand the difference between there's a social behavior in Brussels or a social pattern in Brussels that would make you still speak English in your daily life, which would not happen in Mexico. That's what I kind of understood. Yeah.
I think there's a way, can I mention that it's a possibility to think international kind of recognition about some people who can recognize themselves in that terms. No? If you say, if you regionalize all the language as queer can be like rock and roll in a way, as a term, but and it can recognize everybody who is interested into using the terms, and so it's a double-faced kind of a medal that you say. I think you say it can be a privilege to know that terms when you're in Mexico or in Mali or in Brussels or I don't know, in Sarajevo maybe, but in the other hand, it's a way to recognize everybody under a same kind of, I don't know, doubts and questions and way of life of some terms, some point. Don't you think?
Yeah, I also, when you said rock and roll, I thought of punk. And count has been also a term that has been imported, and you learn it, but it's still until later a revolutionary term. Like it has, like you said, that double edge, I guess. And the term gay probably had that same historiography, right?
Oh, perhaps. Okay, nothing, don't worry.
No, I'm not sure, because I can feel myself as gay, but I can feel myself interested into queer for some point. And gay, as I can see it or understanding it, it's more related to some homosexual practices. Then queer is more related to some ideas or who are not always homosexuals, related to homosexual practices. So queer, after the book of William Burroughs, can be a kind of also literary term, as punk is, as some other term or some other English term are. And maybe like bourgeois is a French term you can use in the US, or there is a lot of terms who can be used by everybody in the world who can be recognized. Of course, they are recognized differently to some different.
But I think if in New Zealand I said bourgeois, I would be describing, on one hand, a class, but maybe more importantly, I would be describing my intellectual access to a certain understanding of class.
I understand.
And that is something that totally comes from a French, from an importation into New Zealand of a French tradition of critique, actually. Do you understand?
I totally understand, but I think that was my point.
Yeah. No,
this is the two sides of the same medal,
Yeah.
It's just in the end, we can make a proposition like everybody must stay in his region, in his own community, on his 100 square meters with his friends who speak the all same languages. But in the end, it's a way to recognize everybody in the whole world. And it's always
no, for sure, and totally in that way. I think like the language that you use, even the fact that in this room tonight we're speaking English together, the way you use language indicates a certain, gives you a certain context or communicates a certain idea about how you've moved through the world up until that point in time. Because if I say in New Zealand bourgeois, automatically I'm university educated. This is without the question. So it tells the person that I'm speaking to, one, that I am university educated, and then two, that I have potentially left-leaning sensibilities, but these are all things that are revealed in my speech. My class is revealed in my speech.
When I was saying punk when I was 15 or something, it was the same thing, because it means that I go out of my suburb proletarian things and then go into the city.
Yeah.
When I was 15. So I don't know if we have to can we cut out of our educations to go into something, or there is just gesture?
Yeah, no, I mean I completely agree, and I think there was mentioned in the talk that we just heard about some kind of that these terms like queer can also mean a sort of transnational solidarity. I think is the term that you used. Like it can also be that, but it can at the same time be something that creates a cut or a problem within a specific geographical context, like New Zealand or like.
Is a difficulty.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are we doing?
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like, with both, that I believe is the challenge, and that there are important questions to ask and not just assume it, because it is, in my experience and understanding, that queer in Anglo-North America talks less about class than it does outside of it. because Latin America is very socially stratified through class. So my issue, or what I am trying to contend, is that class and skin tonalities are as defining of subject's formation as gender and class. Gender and sex. But I also don't want to miss out on the opportunity that queer as methodology can have to, to analyze visual art, and I don't see this as separate, as constituted of subjectivity of our subject formation. There is this academic of visual arts, Amelia Jones, who in her latest book, Seeing Differently, A History, don't quote me on that. Seeing Differently is the first title, but she's talking about a specific methodology that she calls queer feminist irrationality, in which to see a work of art and to also be seeing another body, there is a duration in time. For example, a performance that maybe happened in the 70s, and then you see a photograph of it, and you see the photograph of it 30 years later, it's still holding something for you. And you're still, when you are seeing this work of art, are still interpreting. There is a relationality that happens in which you create meaning. And, for example, in particularly feminist Kant art, that gaze is directed back at you. The same way as that photograph of Lorena that you saw is staring at the camera back. So there's that binary of fetishizing between the image and you only creating significance or a meaning about that work of art is caught because they're looking back at you, and there is a relationality that gets formed in which you're always interpreting and creating meaning. So it doesn't stop like the photographs of Lorena in the 70s. It continues to hold now, and it's different, and in a different time and context, like for me in Mexico and for you there. And in that creating meaning, we are creating, like you said, who we are and how we move through the world. So that basically cuts also with the idea that the spectator needs to be objective and distanced from the work to have to be able to have like a critical judgment of a work of art. And we're not thinking of Kant anymore, or at least I don't want to be thinking that way, or in a body that is a Cartesian kind of body in which I think, therefore I am, but there's more to thinking and feeling, and my body is in relation to other bodies constantly, and it's always incomplete, and there is an emotion and an anxiety that I have when I see any type of work of art, and I will say of visuality, not only a photograph, but also another body. And I relate differently to someone that I believe, and I wish it wasn't that way, because I would like to have a queer methodology always, but it's not the case. Desire happens differently, to me at least, and so I do relate differently to different kind of bodies. And I don't want to pretend I don't. And that same happened with all visuality. It's all a perception, and it's all how I interpret it. And that forms who I am. So I believe like that's an important question to make conscious, because as much as I don't want to be have like an intellectual colonization with these foreign terms that mean specific identities, it is important that we all have solidarity that is transnational, in which we can try to guarantee basic rights, even though the discourse of human rights is totally liberal, but we need it. And I hope I made sense.
A little bit. In a way.
So,
Sorry, I didn't get that.
oh,
A little bit, he said?
he said a little bit.
That was a joke, it was a joke. It was okay.
So if no one else wants to add anything, I propose that we wave goodbye to Susana, who's having a coffee in the morning. One thing I would like to do, as you are participating in a collective group, in a group project, of course I introduce you to everyone, but especially to Shasta, who's here, who's going to be doing the talk right after you.
I'm Susana, I'm gonna miss, but you're gonna record it, right?
Record it, yeah. And Lionel, who's also going to speak, and then we're going to show the film of his and Guy HOCQUENGHEM as well as...
It was wonderful, and I'm gonna be in Europe next year, so I hope I have a chance to come by if there's another event and then we can meet.
Yeah, we'll try. And I also introduced you to HUSEYIN, who made the window exhibition, but I think it's not in the room anymore. And so thank you very much.
No, thank you.
And let's try to see each other in real life. Have a great day. We'll drink a beer for you. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Okay, so as I said, it's a very long day. We're going to do a little break in between each one of the talks, so you can have a drink, or I also think Rashida and Stephanie just arrived with soup that they made, so you can also eat something. And the next person who's going to be speaking to us is Shasta ANDWIG, and all of this book installation is an installation of hers that she's going to be using for her talk, which is titled Aryan versus Ancient, after the break we're going to have now. Let's say in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we look at the books like that? Yeah. Back into the drum, back to kind of like a 0.0 in a way. So, then I start to do my research, and it's actually quite difficult to find books for the English reader on Burundi. Though I have been lucky to find one writer, which is Jean-Pierre Chrétien. And this guy, he actually, one of the reasons, well, many reasons, but one of the reasons that he's to be taken serious is that he talks about plausibility. And he writes about basically the Great Lakes region, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, parts of Tanzania, parts of Congo. And he writes history 2,000–3,000 years back in time, only using linguistics. Or not only using linguistics, but using linguistics as his main tool. And in this book, which has 5 chapters, pretty much equal chapters, he has dedicated one whole chapter just to writing history in Africa. Because there are so many difficulties in this, because first of all we're dealing with a culture which comes from an oral tradition, but also you have the dilemma of that the first written texts were written by the colonial rulers, the so-called white fathers, and then the first generation of writers who are kind of local, they tend to also have motivations of wanting to be friends with the colonizers. So you have all this kind of maneuvering that you need to do if you're going to start to actually form a
proper image of the history 2,000–3,000 years back. And of course I have to say myself that just discovering that you can write history several thousand years back in time, only using linguistics, analyzing whether a word is borrowed, analyzing whether a word is a new invention, that in itself I think is quite extraordinary. Even though of course they also do use things like level of the Nile, pottery, now more and more in our days they also of course use a lot more DNA, things like this. But what is also quite interesting with this guy, KJERTI, is that he also places value on the oral tradition. So he will say that if a history repeats itself over a larger region, quite similar, you can start to put some trust onto it. And then in regard to my project, which is sort of wanting to tell the sort of whole history of the humankind, so to say, of course I think that language in itself is maybe the greatest invention of humankind. And I know that here there are many people who will have lots of opinions when it comes to what constitutes a language. Because animals have language, stuff like this. But me, I say that human language is quite a specific thing, and it has a massive impact on our development. Then also, of course, one thing is the sort of history of the region. But then, of course, I also started to look at drum traditions all over Africa. And I'm not going to go too much into the technicalities of all of this. But there is a few drums I would like to address because they're kind of pertaining to the issue. And one of them is what is called a talking drum. And talking drums is something that you find pretty much all over Africa, but in particularly in West Africa. And it's basically where you use two notes to play language. And it's not like Morse code, you're actually playing a real language. And in order to do this, you need what is called a tonal language. And a tonal language means that the whole meaning of a sentence changes depending on where you put the pressure. So we have it slightly in Latin language, even though Arabic and Latin languages are not tonal. Even though we have it slightly in the sense that the meaning will change slightly, the content of the meaning will change slightly from if you say, don't let him come, to don't let him come. So it has a slightly difference in the content of the meaning, but it's still the same. But in a tonal language, this meaning can be completely different. And so they play the tones that goes up and down. And what is also quite interesting with the talking drum is that when the first colonial rulers, which they came to Africa, they hadn't even invented the telegraph. And so to begin with, the Europeans actually thought that the Africans had all these supernatural powers because they could communicate up to about 12 kilometers on these drums. And I'm also thinking just to play you a little bit so you just can hear a bit what it sounds like. I would recommend to have a look at the books after, particularly actually the book about these talking drums is quite interesting. It also has a chapter on the different names that the different African tribes would give to the white colonizers. For instance, there's one name, given to one Protestant missionary, which meant one who is always feverishly busy. But it's quite, yeah, quite fun. And also it's, what I've kind of understood, at least what I think I've understood, is that it's quite common for quite a lot of African musical tradition to actually be founded on language and words. So for instance, in traditional Burundian drums, they're not talking drums at all, but I've been told that if someone forgets the rhythm, you can just say the sentence, you can just say the words, and then the rhythm is kind of implicit. And also you have this thing, for instance, people that understands voodoo properly will be able, when they hear salsa music, to hear which kind of gods that are being called upon. So of course all of this kind of also made me think about whether it would be possible to arrange our society through musical principles instead of democracy and human rights and all these kind of things. What if we just try to organize things based upon musical principles of harmony and disharmony and so on? And then I came across the Akka pygmies, which live in Central Africa. And it would be an exaggeration to say that they arrange their societies from musical principles. But they do kind of use music and sound quite actively in a sort of social control, if we can call it like this. So for instance, the Akka pygmies do not operate with ego or individualism. This is not a part of their idea. So if someone is, for instance, very good at hunting, it's very important that he doesn't hunt all the time, because then he can start to think that he is better than other people. And if people start to think that they are better than other people, then you will send the kids on them. And the kids will laugh and sing stupid songs about the people who think that they are more worth than something else. And they also kind of live in a pretty equal society between men and women. The idea of balance is quite important. And so, for instance, also when the men go out to hunt, it's actually the woman who catches the prey, and she catches it with her singing. So she sings catching the elephant, and then the men go and collect them. Kind of a perfect communist society, even though of course it's a very small society, usually. And I was just thinking also just to play this this yele, which is what is called when the woman catches the elephant with her singing. And of course I'm not a composer, so I was then thinking about the ideas if it's possible, for instance, to compose from dancing, which is also kind of something that I read in one of the books, that in a lot of African musical tradition, or not musical tradition, cultural tradition, the way that things operate is basically that paintings is based upon African sculpture, and African sculpture is always pertaining to African dance, and African dance is of course always pertaining to African music, and African music is always pertaining to the African language. So this is kind of why I also started to have this idea, so maybe it's possible to compose in an opposite direction. But then there is kind of a big shift in my project, because doing all this research, I was also working on other projects. But then in July 2014, I go to Glasgow for 5 months, where I have time only to focus on this project. And in Glasgow there are two quite important things that happens. And the one thing is that I become quite active in a political debate forum on Facebook, which is called Vi som bryr oss om avisa Klassekampen, which pretty much means in Norwegian, we who cares about the newspaper class fight or class struggle. And it's actually a political forum that was started as a protest forum against this newspaper, because this newspaper made a shift from being a political newspaper into becoming quite a cultural newspaper. But this is kind of, yeah, and the people there are, of course, it's a wide spectrum of people on the left side, but it is also people who've kind of been thrown out of the Communist Party, people who have a kind of, how to say, no tolerance when it comes to, or how do you say that, opposite, freedom of speech. It's I mean, it's 100% freedom of speech, and where you are not afraid of talking about groups, you're not afraid of talking about quite complicated and difficult questions. So this is the one thing that sort of happens when I'm there. And I guess also because, yeah, my grandfather was always the sort of person that would challenge my ideas. And then here in this forum I find people that are kind of turning things that you think you believe upside down, kind of. Though the other thing that happens is that I was recommended by a friend to read a writer, a Senegalese writer called Cheikh Anta Diop. I can't pronounce his name for sure. It's written here. And he was basically a Senegalese biologist. I would also say sort of historian and activist, who started to publish already in the 50s. And what he claims, if we're going to sum it up quite quick, is that Egypt was a black civilization. It is not a Semitic civilization as the one that we are presented in Disney movies and so on. And this is kind of his big sort of struggle through all his career, is basically to prove this fact. And quite interesting is that I don't remember if this was in the 60s or in the 70s, but at one point the Egyptian government decided to take up some old mummies to check their stomach content, where among other things they actually found cocaine, which is not supposed to have been something in Egypt at that time. So that's still something that they haven't really figured out. But Diop asked if he could please just take a sample of the skin to see the level of melatonin. And of course the Egyptian authorities denied him this. So what he had done though is, for instance, you can measure the hair, thickness of hair, because that varies a lot. And if you measure the thickness of the hair, it is definitely negroid. It's not white, Semitic, Asian, it's black. But still, this is the one thing that kind of like nobody still wants to accept. And me, I started then to read this book, Civilization or Barbarism, and for about 4 hours I was so struggling with this. I was like, no, why does this matter? What does it matter if the Egyptian were black or Semitic? Does that mean, for instance, that the Norwegian Sami people, the nomadic people who didn't create big civilization, does that mean that they are less worth? Or, I mean, all these kind of like objections happens, and I think also because of my upbringing, I sort of did not expect that I would be so shocked again in the world, that the idea I have of what is history and what is the truth were so, in a way, off. But then after 4 hours, it just hits me that, wow, this is just the most important thing ever. One has here kind of stolen away the history of a whole people. And also one thing that Diop says is also that you will never ever understand African historiography if you cannot get Egypt right. Egypt is so important for the rest of Africa. So if you try to kind of cut it out of Africa, which is in itself kind of bizarre as Egypt is on the African continent, but you will never get this historiography correct if you don't connect it to Egypt. And here you see some images also that he has collected, which is quite interesting. The image at the bottom here, for instance, it has been called the strangers because they looked too black, too negroid. So we do not call them Egyptian, we call them the strangers. So the thing is with Diop is that what one has done in the English publications is that one has collected very many different French texts into a few English books, which kind of makes these books quite difficult to read. So I would say he's a very important historical figure, but for the English reader there are better books. Here we see the weeks and so I was very, very happy when I came across a book called Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, The Falsification of Ancient Greek, 1785 till 1985. It's written by Martin Bernal.
Of the South Carolina Educational Television Network. How it happened that Egyptians came to the Peloponnese, and what they did to make themselves kings in that part of Greece has been chronicled by other writers. I will add nothing, therefore, but proceed to mention some points which no one else has yet touched upon.
So, Martin Bernal gave out the book Black Athena in 1987, I think the book came out. And he's quite an interesting writer because he actually was a linguist specializing in Asian languages. Chinese, Japanese, so on. But then he had like a midlife crisis, and then he decided, because he has some Jewish roots, so he decided to learn Hebrew. And in learning Hebrew, he came across a dictionary between Hebrew and Egyptian hieroglyphs. And when he saw this, he just understood that there is something completely wrong here in how one has interpreted the languages. And then he starts a 10-year investigation into what he has called the falsification of ancient Greek. And what is quite interesting also with Martin Bernal is because he is one of the few people that's kind of been taken slightly serious. So contrary to the Senegalese, Cheikh Anta Diop, which has been sort of tried to be ridiculed, he has been accused of being a racist, all these kind of things. But since Martin Bernal is a white writer, who therefore by definition doesn't have like a self-motivation, he has actually been taken at least serious by other academics. And basically what Martin Bernal claims is that there is a shift in history, or in our understanding of history, around 1750, 1780. And he defines this as what he calls the ancient model and what he calls the Aryan model. And what he basically claims is that up until the 1700s, everybody believed that mathematics and philosophy comes from Egypt and that the Egyptians were black. But in the 1700s, there are several things that happens that makes us having to change this history. And Martin Bernal contributes that to, I guess, four reasons. And that is one, what he called progression. One starts to get an idea of progression. One gets the idea that some people are progressive and other people are not progressive. So one starts, for instance, to talk about how Egyptian sculptures are passive, how Egyptians were not capable of thinking abstract. They are not, by definition, progressive. And of course, this, I presume, has to do with the idea of the Industrial Revolution. Things become progressive. So this is the one thing. And the other thing is he contributes it to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment / racism. Because there are kind of two results of the Enlightenment, and one of them is that you have a recession or regression, because it's kind of like everything is suddenly kind of like out there, and then a lot of people become protective. But the other thing that also happens is that we can't explain things with God anymore. So before we could treat people like shit because they are savages. They don't have a God. But then suddenly we are in the realms of science, Darwin, all these things happens. And then we need to have so-called scientifical explanations of why we can allow ourselves to do these things that we're doing. And this is also on the very high time of the transatlantic slave trade. So we are doing slave trade and we are discovering Africa, and therefore we need an explanation of why we can do this to other people. And before we had the Bible in our hand, Bible is out, we need so-called scientific explanations, and therefore you have the racist, the kind of ultra extreme Aryan model happening. He also contributes it slightly to the sort of Hellenistic romantic ideas. There is a war, I think, between Turkey and Greece about Crete. You have Lord Byron, Shelley, all these people that travels to Greece. And you have this kind of the beginning of this romantic idea of Greece as the cradle of modern civilization, of Western civilization, and of course of democracy. So this is the kind of four reasons that he says is why this shift happens. And of course, this is the book where he tells about the story, but then there are two books which are even bigger than this, where he just presents evidence of what he would say makes this the plausible explanation. We have changed this history. Yeah, it's another kind of interesting things that he sort of talks about is, of course, how one, how to say, how one changes the definition of what is classical civilization. So, for instance, now we define the beginning of classical civilization with writing, but we do not acknowledge hieroglyphs as writing, for instance. So we do all these kind of tricks to not place the origin of modern civilization to Egypt. Anyway, so this Martin Bernal and this idea of the Aryan model, which is the new model that we're living in today, he would say that before, like in the 1800s, we were living in the extreme Aryan model, which kind of culminated in Holocaust. And after Holocaust, we are now in the just Aryan model. He thinks eventually we will get back to the ancient model, but we'll see. But so anyway, this inspired me to make a work, let me see, which is called Aryan versus Ancient. And basically I made this drum, and the skin is actually from an old Burundian drum. And the image is a picture of the first Egyptian pharaoh, the pharaoh that collected the north and south of Egypt. And the composition inside is me playing around with the score of a Central African polyphony, where I've used the samples of Michael Jackson, and then I've kind of applied sort of my idea, at least, of Western classical musical principles. I was thinking I was going to play you that piece. Okay, so this goes in a loop, which kind of brings us to present time. Because of course, this sort of also opened up the whole field of Afrocentric literature and the idea of Eurocentrism. And for instance, there's one book called the Afrocentric Manifesto by an Molefi Asante. And one of the things, because he also talks a lot about, of course, this idea of progression and the importance of the histography and so on, but he also talks about one important thing, which is to identify the sender. So it's not really so important whether things come from a right wing or left wing or any kind of perspective like this liberal, don't matter. What is important is that you can identify the sender, that you know where it comes from. Though one thing that for me kind of has become sort of the sort of, yeah, how to say, big sort of discovery in a way, is how this Eurocentric perspective is kind of infiltrating absolutely every aspect of how we think, of how we perceive the world. And it's happening in all these kind of like very unconscious ways. For instance, I have a school book here, which is used today in Belgium schools. And this school book, you will for instance see that we have images of evolution. So here's the little monkey, and here's the not so much monkey, and here's the black man. And then you turn the page, and voila, we have civilization in Asia, in Europe, in South America. So it's not directly explicit spoken, but it is implicit. For instance, another kind of thing I just saw a few days ago in a Norwegian newspaper also is like a big headline like a refugee from Yemen gave back 1,000 euros. And then you're supposed to be like, yeah, okay, people from Yemen are decent people. But what the text is actually saying is quite the opposite. It's kind of saying, wow, it's a miracle. So it's in all these kind of ways. And also like how you would talk about European architecture and you would talk about African huts. And also quite interesting in regard to linguists or linguistics is, for instance, that now the consensus is that we don't know if language happened in one place or if it just magically happened everywhere at the same time. 10 years ago, the consensus was that it's definitely not happened in one place at one time. Now they're a bit more like, okay, we don't know. But of course the reason is that you do not want to say that it comes from one place, because that means, again, you would have to put it in Africa. So it's in every kind of level one are trying to sort of whitewash our origin. And then I guess the last thing I was really going to say is that for me also that it happened so recently, like already 1785, it's not so long ago, but of course also in this book in particular, one also talks about all the way until the 1392. Which is quite interesting that Christopher Columbus, the same year as he so-called discovered the Americas, the same year he actually threw out 3 million Muslims and 300,000 Jews out of Spain. So also this idea of deporting as well as going and discovering and conquering the world is of course quite connected. And of course I think the idea of this Eurocentric perspective started already there, where you have 2,000 soldiers who kill 200,000 soldiers in 2 hours, and the idea of the superior being is kind of created. And I also believe that it is because of this Eurocentric perspective that we're all living in, that we are now invading Syria, and that we feel that it is, of course, our right to come and fix the world. And that is the last I will say on the matter. unless there's any questions, of course.
Yes, I have one. So, tell me if I don't speak up, you know. I had a question about your sources, because you started saying that you're not from an academic background, or as an artist, you tend to experience this research in a different way than an academic would do. But then in the end, you use really academic concepts such as Afrocentrism or Eurocentrism. And the first video you choose to show us, for me, was really striking, because you didn't really introduce that it's a show called Belgium. It's got talent, you know, African artists doing drums. And I was a little disappointed that you were not more specific about where your sources were from, apart from Cheikh Anta Diop. You didn't really situate, like we could see that this antenna, black antenna book, the video you showed was from South Carolina, and I wonder whether basing your thinking over these cultures only from European, Western thinkers, book authors doesn't participate in the way you apprehend this music, the rhythm, the culture, in some sort of Eurocentrism itself. And are you going to try? Are you going to, like, do you think of working with African artists or reading more books from people? Because what is also really interesting with Cheikh Anta Diop is that he was writing in the 50s at a time where African intellectuals were fighting against colonialism that was still happening, and also the fact that they would go into this thinking of African culture, global culture coming from Africa, and African thinking being equal to the European one, is also because they wanted to legitimate that they could have nations, their own nations, and fight the colonial power. So, well, it's a big question, but in terms of your practice, because that's the point of today, how do you think you're going to work this music, drums, rhythm aspect of your research, not only from your Eurocentric perspective?
Well, I think that I'm never going to be able to get out of it. I think that's another thing. I mean, I am a white person. I've grown up in Europe, and I think that is just something that to acknowledge, and I'm not going to be able to get out of that one. But of course, it's in my interest to work with people from everywhere, not just only Africa, because the more, if you're going to kind of go into the whole idea of the world history or historic time in a kind of global sense, then of course there's a lot of other drum cultures. But in regard to the question, if I understand it correctly, of course I'm definitely going to work with other people from outside of the Eurocentric realm. Though I have to say, with the thing with the Belgium's Got Talent, that was quite on purpose.
Mm-hmm. And the sources, the books you quoted from all your, are they mostly from, you know, Western, European ethnographics that also have a perspective on this culture, and meaning the interpretation or the analysis they make out of it, linguistics, are not neutral. They also come from ideology that you explained in the end. So are you open to an interpretation that would maybe mean that the whole idea of rhythm you got so far could be wrong, and then there's another explanation? Okay.
Oh, of course, and I think this is, again, like for me, it's an investigative process. Mm-hmm. So I don't really know where things will end up, for sure. But, well.
Okay. Thank you.
No, it's interesting.
There's also I don't understand about plausibility.
Plausibility, yeah. Basically, unless we're talking about mathematics and natural science, the closest you can really get is plausibility. So what I mean is that scientists who are working, let's say, or scientists, historians, basically, in particularly, what we're talking about here, historians that say things with 100% certainty is something that you should be cautious of. Because the historians that I perceive to be serious are the ones that really talk about, this is the most plausible solution. We have this evidence, we have this evidence, we have this evidence. The most plausible answer is that it happened like this. This is what I mean with this.
How is it plausible?
Yes.
And where is your point, in a way? And at the end, because okay, we have all this, which is very interesting for a lot of points, of course, for sure. And there is this thing there's something I always think about was Elizabeth Taylor, that's Cleopatra, you know, things like that. And all this kind of imagery, because I think you talk a lot about imagery, in a way. Of course, politically related and historically related, blah, blah, blah. But what's your point?
Well, my point is basically that I'm going to make an artwork, which is going to be a composition. That's my point. But then, of course, I think that all these things that I come across in this process is quite interesting for other people, particularly people in this kind of forum. So that is my point here and now, to share some of the things that I've discovered in the process. Yeah. Though I was a bit worried that I might jinx the whole project by actually talking about it before it's finished.
That's good.
Why did you choose Michael Jackson?
The reason I chose Michael Jackson is basically, it's I guess two reasons, and one is that he's a kind of universal person, that everybody has a sort of, everybody heard him, everybody has a relationship to him. So then I don't, in the moment exactly who do you choose, it becomes quite an important issue, and he's the kind of person I knew that everybody kind of know him. And of course he's also someone that kind of was really a victim of the Eurocentric ideas and kind of did this sort of transition from being black and wanting to become white, so it gave meaning to use him. Though also this kind of piece, it's sort of like what I call a kind of satellite, because you have ideas as you work towards the bigger project. So this is also kind of just kind of me playing around, learning music, learning how the different things work.
Can you tell us a bit more about your artistic practice in general? You said you were not a composer, but you make music. What kinds of art forms do you work with?
Well, I work with sculptures very often, or I work with ideas, and then they very often tend to become sculptures. But before, I've also used to work with professional musicians, so then I pay a musician to do a piece for me. But now I feel that the answer of what I'm looking for is actually in the music theory. So I actually have to understand and learn the music theory in order to be able to make what I hope to make. So this is, But I've very often been working with big sculptures, actually, quite big sculptures. And some sculptures that also become speakers, stuff like this.
Sculptures that become speakers?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Basically, you can use this surface-sensitive speakers, and then you can make the book into a speaker, or you can make the table into a speaker, or a stone into a speaker. Yeah. But and I also very often work with big projects that go over very many years.
Well, if anyone has any other question, I can think we can also take another break right now, and then Lionel and I are going to present Razep, the movie that we're going to watch at the end of the night.
Ah non, mais je vais pas faire
non, c'est l'édition originale. Dans l'édition originale, il y a aussi une intro de...
Donc le phare, ils le connaissent, ils l'ont déjà vu, de toute façon, ils l'ont vu hier. Et s'ils veulent le voir, bon, je l'ai. J'ai les droits.
Ah, ok.
Parce que c'est Hélène, c'est 15G qui sont j'ai les droits. Ça n'aura aucun problème.
Il y a une citation de Charles Péguy.
Je sais, il adore Charles Péguy. C'est pour ça que ça me fait de la peine de quitter. Mais... il adore Charles Péguy. Oui, il dit voilà que c'est lié à... Il était l'élève de Gilles Deleuze, Guy Hocquenghem. Et Gilles Deleuze a fait la préface de son premier C'est son premier livre de nouvelles qui s'appelle La famille des faunes. C'est très proche. Mais il n'empêche qu'avec Michel Pressol, il a écrit un livre qui s'appelle le premier livre sur Deleuze, et qu'à la fin il y avait une lettre d'un PD qui attaquait Deleuze sur sa bourgeoisie, sur le fait qu'il était straight et qu'il se servait des PD. C'était une lettre provocative exprès. Il a fait une réponse absolument magnifique. Et René a fait un cours là-dessus. Et en fait, c'était pas Michel Pressol, c'était Guy HOCQUENGHEM qui avait écrit. Et comme il était l'élève de Deleuze et son ami, Michel était son secrétaire plus ou moins ainsi. Ils avaient fait une question provocante.
About, but now you just mentioned the last chapter of the film, which title is once again Royal Opera. That's the last chapter, and there is something that happens in that Royal Opera is that it's set in the future. So although the film has this second degree historical film that tells you the history of homosexuality, suddenly this disruption in narrative in which you have something which is in the future breaks many things.
Yes, especially the 16th.
Also, and regarding
60s.
And regarding regarding this Royal Opera, this narrative break that speaks about the future also happens with the one chapter that speaks about Paris. Because this last chapter tells the story of a man who finds an American tourist in a bar, and then they spend the night together on the streets of Paris. I thought, having read lately the book Le Gay Voyage by Guy HOCQUENGHEM, I got one quote about a cinema in Paris where people would cruise. And this chapter in Le Gay Voyage, it's called Paris Luxor. And the way he's going to describe the film, also he's going to describe this cinema, I think also plays a role in this other mythology of Paris. So in this quote he says, au bord d'une île automobile qui est le boulevard Vargas, juste au coin de Carrefour Delta qui couronne le métro aérien, mon Alexandrie de carton-pâte. C'est le cinéma le Luxor, qui est à lui seul une cité orientale vouée aux tuniques grecques et aux cuirasses romaines de série B. So I found...
Make a translation.
Oh yeah, the translation of this is, he's saying that on the side of the automobile Nile River, that is the Boulevard Barbès in Paris, just at the corner of the Delta Carrefour, that it's crowned by the Aryan Metro, sits my own cardboard Alexandria. This is the cinema Luxor, that is by itself an oriental city dedicated to Greek tunics. That's what you said?
Peplum.
Yeah, to Peplum and B-series Greek films. So he's going to speak about this cinema, creating what is something that we just spoke about, speaking about Paris, of this other mythology of Paris, creating the other mythology, which I understand is like so to demake the dominant mythology of Paris, which is something I believe this chapter makes. So perhaps you could develop a little bit on the on this last chapter, Royal Opera.
And it's very interesting for you because he make I don't have here, but he make in a review called Night, something like that. He make a text about l'incendie, comment on dit, the burning of the Bibliothèque d'Alexandrie, and he write all a story. It was a story of love between two guys. One was jealous, and one put the fire, and they watch all the books to burn, and they make love with the flames and all that. It was a delir, but the cinema called the Luxor exists, and now the Mary, the City Hall buy the Luxor and make a real cinema theater, real theaters for movies. But at this period, and I knew very well this, it was a place where we can see for the Arab of Barbès is very, Algerian, Moroccan, Tunisian people, black people, and very, but now become more bobo, more bourgeois. But anyway, at this period it was
No, for the first talk.
it was a place. No, it's still mixed people.
Yeah.
He lives near. He's still mixed people. But Paris became very expensive, very expensive. So all the poor people are pushed away, you know, like in all the city, New York, and all the city are like that now. They push people. In New York, when I was in New York, it was the contrary. People want to go outside of New York for be in a big house, you know, and the center when I was living, it was for the poor people, squatters and toxicomans and the travestite and prostitute people, and the rent was very cheap, very cheap.
In the 80s.
In the 80s, yes, 79. I come back 83. And so I come back 83 because I appear in New York in 83 with a friend of me died of that, and me I was thinking, because they call that gay cancer, but it's nothing to see with the movie. But, so
No, it was more about the mythology of Paris, that it's...
Yes, so the mythology of Paris, so I tell you that in Rue Sainte-Anne, who is very near the Tuileries Park,
Yeah,
Tuileries?
the Park of Tuileries, yeah.
and so it was a sort of parcours,
A walk?
a walk, that we make all the night, every day, every night, in fact. So, because we don't have enough money for go to the very important people of Rue Sainte-Anne, the Seven, the Colony, and so on, we go to a bar called Royal Opera, who was near a big avenue called Avenue de l'Opéra, and after midnight become a gay place. But before it was for old ladies who take chocolate with cake. But after midnight, all the people who was prohibited to go to Sainte-Anne, like me and Guy and all the people, poor people, young people, prostitute people, drug addict people, all the la cour des miracles. Stay 2 hours in a sort of fer à cheval, comme on dit, a bar will look like a circle, and so we can watch together. And it was the barmaid was very, comment dire, gentil,
Nice.
Nice. He accepted very well, and it was a big traffic between the toilets and the bar with sex, drugs, and so on. So that's the story of the 78. And so we decided to because we went in, for make this movie, we went in Berlin, because we looked for the archive of Magnus Hirschfeld, that we knew that he was the most important movement in Germany, où influença beaucoup le mouvement français aussi.
That will influence a lot the French movement.
But the French movement was, comment il s'appelait le French movement? My memory is going away. Je cherche l'affiche, tu sais. I'm sorry. Urania. So French movement was called Urania, like a sort of utopia world, called Urania, like Uranus, you know, the planet of love, no? Of sex, I don't know. So Urania, c'est revue de l'homosexualité, review of homosexuality, in his rapport.
In his so a review of homosexuality in its relations with art, literature, history, philosophy, and science.
Voilà. So it was the French movement, and at the same time in Berlin, a very important movement with a lot of review, a movie called Différent des autres.
Different from the others.
Ouais, of Magnus Hirschfeld, that he make a version in 16 and after because the movie was burned by the beginning of the fascist, and he make a second version with a very famous actor called Conrad Veidt, very famous actor of Germany at this period, And Magnus Hirschfeld go from city to other city to show the movie, and he make in Berlin a sort of institute called comment il s'appelait déjà? An institute called I'm very old and my memory go where? Called Institute of Sexuality, something like that. And so they discover that we call now hormones. Hormones. Okay. And so he make thousands of books, of picture, and hundreds of books about all the category of people, transsexual, homosexual, hermaphrodite, and it's a lot of picture, and we don't, in Berlin it was impossible because it was in the East Berlin, and at this period the wall was, it was impossible to have this archive from the East Germany, because it was really a separation, they don't accept homosexuality in East Germany at this period, so, but it was one gay bar. I went one time, they take my jean, and they give me another pants who was very old-fashioned. But anyway, they look very sad, because, you know, everybody was like that, speaking, and it was only gay people, homosexual people. The word gay arrived after that, in '79, from America, and all the French gay movement, homosexual movement, lesbian, and because the movement of art comes from the feminist work, the feminist activists fight for against the droit, for the right of abortion.
Yeah, the right of abortion.
And la
prophylaxis. Birth control.
And so Françoise Daubonne, who was not lesbian but feminist, was a big figure of this movement, like Daniel Guérin, who was in Germany during this period, who took many pictures of the movement. And it was at the beginning, in the 30s, of something strange happens between the government and the youth, like Kuhlewampe, this, you know, camp where young people was in fact together, you know, the way they dress, like now the punk people, or like, you know, with they look like Indian, with big they look a little comme des gitans, des tziganes, des gypsies. They play guitar in the train. They make some sport together, all together without. I see a woman here. But anyway, it was very not military, but because it was a big period of chômage,
unemployment,
and so the people. And at this time, a lot of artists make a lot of pictures with. It was the fashion of naturism.
Yeah, naturism.
So a lot of picture of nude boys, sometime like this Fidus, who become a sort of, comment on dit, une sorte de symbole.
Symbol.
A sort of symbol about, you know, the youth, the naturalism, the nudity, the liberty, and all that. And the Nazi take these people after 3 years after. Fidus become a Nazi. Everybody become a Nazi, like you know the story. We went in Berlin, and it was impossible. It was over the draw, over artists. So he make. This is Hirschfeld himself. I don't know if you see well, but in Berlin we don't find anything. No archive, nothing. It was a gay bar in the West Berlin called Différent des autres, like
different from the others, like the
and they don't have any archive because all was burned and destroyed by the Nazis. But some gay people, some homosexual people, I'm sorry, went in Amsterdam with comment ça s'appelle, enfin tous les livres de Hirschfeld.
With all the
all the library of Martin Hirschfeld. It was a lot of books, and this center in Amsterdam called COC. So maybe it's something like, it was a COC. So, and the people of Amsterdam, our friends, who become now like Nadine, people who become teachers now in Amsterdam University, who make teaching about le genre,
gender
and all that. You know, in Amsterdam, at this period, it was le pays le plus avancé sur l'homosexualité.
At that period, it was the most advanced country regarding homosexual matters.
But anyway, the Stonewall period, 69, in America, some French people like Guy Chevalier and saw that and come back in France with the idea to make the same revolution against the straight people, the heteroflic, heterocops, and so that in this rapport contre la normalité, who decide that lesbian and homosexual people has to make the revolution and the contrary of what happens now. But anyway, Gierkenheim is dead, so I don't know what he think. It can be. Some people say, if Gierkenheim was here, he was against marriage and all that. Nobody knows. He's dead. He's dead. Nobody can speak for him. And so your question was why? So in Amsterdam, the COC,
it was about,
I'm very long, I'm sorry.
Don't worry. I think with this, I mean, you can close this question and then we
close the question, okay. So we asked to the COC the permission to shoot and to take picture of all these books. It was and they said, no, it's not possible, you have to ask a permission, and maybe in 3 months or 4 months. So we come back very sad to see our friend, and they say, okay, between noon and 2 o'clock, they go to eat. So I have the key, you come with your camera, your picture, and you have 2 hours for take all the documents in picture and to shoot. And so we make that completely. And it was very, very fast. And so that's the reason, because I make 1,000 pictures maybe, and all this part that you can see in the movie. It was no light. You know, we have no permission, so it was no noise. And it was like outlaw, like des voleurs.
Like a stealer, like a burglar.
But we come back in Paris with all these documents, and so we make the second part about Manu Hirschfeld from this archive.
So I feel a very nice thing is that because of your very long answers, all of my questions have been wonderfully answered. Matters about the normalization of homosexuality through things like marriage, you just spoke about it, the importance of the team you work with when you're doing experimental homosexual movies in the 70s in France, that's fully answered. So I believe that what Lionel has said about the movie is already very much enough for you to just enjoy the movie. So I propose to do a last break for a cigarette or beer or a soup if anyone needs, and then we pass to watch the film. And I want to thank Stéphane once more for all the help with this project, and Lionel, as well as Susana Vargas, who's now in Mexico, and HUSEYIN, who did the exhibition.
Thank you.
Ethiopian, West